Dear students, welcome to this lecture. Today's topic for discussion is nature and forms of conflict, and to understand the differences between intrastate, interstate and global conflicts. The main objectives of today's lecture are to know the trends of armed conflicts in contemporary times, to understand the difference between intrastate, interstate and global conflicts, to understand the meaning of intrastate conflicts and its various types, to understand the meaning of interstate conflict and its various types, and finally to understand the meaning of global conflicts and its various causes. Dear students, first let's start with the introduction. Conflicts between countries have been some of the deadliest affairs in human history. An estimated 60 million people, 3% of the world's population, died during World War II. But since World War II ended in 1945, interstate wars have become increasingly rare. This trend, however, does not mean that we are living in peaceful times. Conflicts within countries, intrastate conflicts, have become much more common. Many of the deadliest conflicts of 21st century have occurred within the borders of single country. In today's interconnected world, challenges within one country's borders have ramifications for entire globe. Terrorists can capitalize on instability created by conflict to plot attacks at home and in faraway cities. Infectious disease outbreaks in conflict zones can easily spread uncontrolled across borders. And millions of refugees fleeing violence can increase pressure on neighboring countries' public services. Dear students, let's have a look first on intrastate conflicts. Intrastate conflict is the most common form of conflict today. It describes sustained political violence that takes place between armed groups representing the state and one or more non-state groups. Violence in this form of conflict is usually confined within the borders of a single state, but usually has a significant international dimensions and holds the risk of spilling over into bordering states. Dear students, let's have a look on the types of intrastate conflicts. First, war of secession. Conflicts involving groups of people united by common beliefs, aims, or territory that fight to establish an independent country. In the American Civil War, southern slave-holding states attempted to break away from United States and form a new country, the Confederate States of America, where slavery would remain legal. Second, war of succession. Conflicts involving groups of people seeking to overthrow and replace a country's government or ruling authority. For example, in 2011, anti-government protesters in Libya overthrew the country's longtime dictator al-Gaddafi. However, 9 years after al-Gaddafi, outsting rebel groups have yet to form a unified government and conflict in Libya persists. Third, violence waged by terrorist or criminal organizations. Conflicts involving terrorists or criminal organizations that commit acts of violence for political, ideological, or financial motivations. For example, in Mexico, cartels use violence to exert control over the country's politics and dominate its illegal drug market. In 2018, drug-related violence resulted in more than 33,000 homicides, including the deaths of at least 130 candidates and politicians. Number 4. State-sanctioned violence. Conflicts involving the police, military, or other government groups persecuting the country's own citizens, often targeting those from a minority group. For example, for decades, Buddhist majority Myanmar has persecuted religious minority in the country, including Rohingya Muslims. This persecution escalated in 2016 with a brutal crackdown by country's military, which the United Nations labeled as genocide. Number 5th, resource-driven conflict. Conflicts involving several groups vying to control profit from country's natural resources. For example, South Sudan's lucrative oil reserves drive conflict. The government-controlled oil sector makes up to 60% of South Sudan's gross domestic product, but most of country does not benefit from the oil industry's profit. Citizens have protested the oil companies' appropriation of oil revenues, urging transparency and accountability. In response, the government has increasingly militarized oil production zones. Dear students, let's have a look how these intra-state conflicts are resolved. States have various tools for responding to intra-state conflicts. Governments can become more inclusive through free and fair elections, institute reforms to address underlying drivers of conflict, and pursue diplomacy or offer economic incentives to opposition groups. Outside mediation can also prove productive when parties to intrastate conflict have been unable to compromise. For example, foreign countries can try to bring the warring groups to diplomatic talks. This was the case in Northern Ireland in the 1990s after 3 decades of fighting between the region's pro-British Protestants and pro-Irish Catholics. With the support of British and Irish governments and mediation by US Senator George Mitchell, Northern Ireland's opposing parties signed a peace deal called Good Friday Agreement, and violence largely ended. Foreign countries can also use sanctions to incentivize one or both parties in intrastate conflicts to come to the negotiating table or implement reforms. This occurred in 1986 when the US Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which imposed economic sanctions on South Africa for its violent discrimination against black South Africans. Additionally, foreign countries can intervene militarily to try to prevent further violence. The United Nations has the capacity to build and deploy its own multinational military force consisting of personnel called peacekeepers supplied by member countries. The United Nations has sent peacekeepers to conflict zones to protect vulnerable people, enforce ceasefires, and safeguard elections, among other missions. In 2019, more than 100,000 peacekeepers were active in 14 countries, constituting the second largest military force deployed abroad, trailing only that of United States. Although these measures can alleviate some of the harm caused by intrastate conflict, they are not always enough to create peace. And in certain instances, outside interference, especially military interference, can even exacerbate fighting, as was the case after North Atlantic Treaty Organization intervening in Libya in 2011. Ultimately, countries have a limited ability to respond to intrastate conflicts elsewhere because of sovereignty, the principle that countries have the authority to control what happens within their boundaries. However, some experts argue that a rethink of traditional understanding of sovereignty is required in an era in which one of the country's domestic issues can trigger global consequences. According to this line of thinking, when countries fail to protect their citizens or do not meet their obligations to other countries to control infectious disease or prevent terrorism, these countries forfeit their right to sovereignty, and foreign countries can and should intervene. Dear students, Let's have a look now on interstate conflicts. Interstate violence is a conflict between two or more than two states who use their respective national forces in the conflict. Wars between countries are among the greatest threats to world order. Throughout history, they have killed tens of millions of people, displaced entire communities, caused trillions of dollars in destruction, and contributed to the spread of hunger, poverty, and disease. It thus comes as welcome news that such costly interstate wars have been on the decline since the end of World War II. However, this trend does not mean that countries peacefully coexist and the threat of full-scale war has disappeared. For one, the potential devastation of war has increased since the introduction of nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. Nuclear armed powers launching a full-scale war today could spell the end of civilization itself. Further, powerful alliances like North Atlantic Treaty Organization serve as a credible deterrent to interstate war, and international institutions such as United Nations provides forums for countries to resolve disputes without resorting to fighting. Some political scientists attribute this trend to the worldwide increase in the number of democracies, arguing that accountable leaders are less willing to make potentially costly and unpopular decisions like going to war. Other experts believe that an increase in international trade has made the world a safer place, as economically interdependent countries are less likely to go to war. Dear students, let's have a look on the types of interstate conflicts. First one, cyber attacks. Countries can use technology to attack an enemy's infrastructure and vital facilities, including its energy grid, communication network, and banking infrastructure. Cyber attacks allow countries to attack opponents covertly from far away and at relatively low risk. For example, Israel has reportedly launched cyber attacks on nuclear enrichment facilities of its adversary Iran and shut down computer systems at a major Iranian port. Number 2. Sanctions. Sanctions are economic penalties countries use to compel people, companies, and other governments to change their behavior on a broad range of issues, including nuclear proliferation and human rights. Although sanctions are seen as low-cost alternatives to war, they can still have devastating consequences by cutting off countries' access to food, energy, and financial resources. US sanctions on Cuba are estimated to have cost the country approximately $130 billion over the last 60 years, a figure far larger than Cuba's economy. Still, while sanctions can accomplish modest objectives, they rarely force a country to fundamentally change course. For example, Cuba's communist government has endured in the face of massive US sanctions, as has Iran's revolutionary government and North Korea's brutal dictatorship. Number 3, tariffs. Taxes on imports or quotas, hard limits on how much of a particular product of a country can import, are two tools government can use to give their domestic industries a leg up on foreign competition or punish other countries for political reasons. These actions, however, are often costly for both sides, as they limit an exporting country's ability to sell products and also make goods more expensive for importing countries. For example, Japan and South Korea are mired in a trade war that has economically harmed both sides, as well as other countries that rely on free-flowing Asian supply chain for the cheap production of electronics like cell phones and computers. Rather than directly waging war, powerful countries can indirectly fight one another by funding or arming opposing sides in a third country. Although these interventions can limit the financial cost of a war and the number of citizen deaths for those powerful countries, they can also turn wars into far larger and deadlier affairs for countries in which fighting is occurring. For example, the Middle East is a home to several proxy wars in which countries most notably rival Iran and Saudi. Governments can directly interfere in another country's internal affairs by supporting or even arming opposition, separatist or terrorist groups to promote instability within an adversary's borders. Another example of interstate conflict can be when countries can attempt to influence elections in other countries in order to support their preferred candidate or simply to sow mistrust in an electoral process. Russian election interference in the United States, France, and Germany has been well documented. But other countries interfere in elections too. For example, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan in 2017 publicly encouraged more than 1 million Germans of Turkish descent to vote against German parties, calling them enemies of Turkey. Countries can try to punish or isolate other governments by limiting or even cutting off diplomatic relations. Diplomatic conflict can take the form of expelling another government's diplomats or ordering the closure of that country's consulates or embassies. Countries including Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates cut ties with Qatar in 2017 over accusations of funding terrorism. These governments closed Qatar's embassies in their countries and banned Qatari planes from using their airspace, while Saudi Arabia sealed off Qatar's only land border. These actions may cost Qatar billions of dollars. One more reason is that countries can manipulate shared ecosystems like rivers and forests in order to benefit themselves or deliberately harm neighbors. Such environmental conflict can contribute to food and water shortage, particularly as global temperatures rise and ecosystems become increasingly vulnerable. For example, Ethiopia's construction of hydroelectric dam on the Nile River threatens Egypt's vital water resource, which supports nearly all of the country's 100 million residents. So serious is the threat that Egypt has threatened military action to halt the dam's construction. Dear students, let's see now the prevention of interstate conflicts. There can be direct conflict prevention. Direct conflict prevention refers to measures that are aimed at preventing short-term, often imminent escalation of potential conflict. Also included in direct prevention are the withdrawals of military force or the involvement of mediators as seen in the present attempt by United States, China and others to ease the rising tensions associated with border lines, which is an inherited grievance from the previous Korean War in the Korean Peninsula. There can be also structural prevention. Structural prevention focuses on more long-term measures which deal with the causes of potential conflict along with potentially escalating and triggering factors. An example of this kind of measures includes economic development, assistance, and or increased political participation. These kinds of measures are most effective in intrastate conflict. Although intrastate conflict may lead to interstate conflict since the conflict can separate to neighboring states due to ethnicity as seen in the most conflicts in Africa. Hence, structural prevention avoids the spread of conflict, thereby serving the purpose of long-term prevention of interstate conflict. Dear students, let's have now a look on global conflicts. The concept of global conflict can be understood in different ways. Since we have focused on war, which is the extreme manifestation of interstate conflict, a similar treatment is accorded to this concept. Accordingly, our focus is on global war, which is treated as the quantitative extension of local war into continental proportions and then its separate beyond. Just as the wars of Europe in 18th and 19th centuries shaped into First and Second World War, so the perspective conflagrations of this century have the potential to become global. While the threat of superpower Armageddon was itself a possibility during the Cold War years, the transfer of nuclear and other highly destructive weapons, the extension of Cold War alliances into local and regional quarrels, pose the challenge of local wars getting out of control. In the case of Korean and Vietnam wars, each of the superpower were almost directly aligned with the original belligerents, and wider ideological confrontation was a factor that foreboded a global war. Fortunately, the very fear of globalized conflict restrained the superpowers from directly joining these conflicts. The superpower balance of terror, as founded on the deterrence doctrine, was instrumental in this process of restraint. In many other instances too, the alliance relationship of the big powers with local powers provided the probability for local wars like Israel-Arab conflicts, the anti-colonial conflicts in northern and southern African regions, and Sino-Indian War escalating into global wars. This is also termed as the outcome of new post-war linkage patterns. Apart from the extension of local or regional war, the stage for global war is much more directly set by the nature of contemporary weapons. Simply put, this is an outcome of global weapons and global strategies. For the devastating capacity of nuclear weapons and global strategies devised to take advantage of these capabilities followed an inevitable corollary. Dear students, let's see first the nuclear weapons and the global conflicts. Because the factor of nuclear weapons is the independent variable in the conversion of wars into global wars, as the number of nuclear weapon states increase de facto, the global war phenomena is brought all the more nearer. Jonathan Schell, in his recent volume, The Unfinished 20th Century, highlights this point. I quote, "A global drama in which decisions regarding the nuclear arms in any part of the world touches off cascades of consequences throughout the world." Unquote. That is, as nuclear weapons are acquired by states involved in regional conflicts, so do global war threats increase. Even though the Cold War scenario may no longer be as relevant as before, the very emergence of single superpower, the United States of America, only further endangers the claim for global interests. Many critics say that the United States of America now affirms such claims with the self-proclaimed role of the world policeman. Especially after 9/11, its assumption of the leadership of the war against international terrorism confers some credibility to this claim. But this claim is now joined to another claim by installing democratic regimes in other parts of the globe. Now, the United States defense and foreign policies are unabashedly based on the assertion that the single major power its paramount interests are global, and its economic and military capabilities have the necessary global reach to protect its claims and interests. Dear students, there is a relationship between terrorism and global conflicts also. Even though international terrorism did not originate only with the Al Qaeda perpetrated attacks on the United States locations on September 11, 2001, it did symbolize the high watermark of the phenomena as constituting a true global threat. The United Nations General Assembly defined global terrorism as a criminal act intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, a group of persons, or particular persons for political purposes. Whatever the considerations of a political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or other nature that may be invoked to justify them. Given this definition from the world body itself, the global potential of terrorism can be clearly assessed. The operations of terrorism are mostly anonymous, but its effects are manifest. The nature of international terrorism can be described as the one with the center anywhere and circumference everywhere. Two rather paradoxically opposite implications for global war flow from this threat. First, the imminent possibility of terrorist groups acquiring nuclear devices and either using them or blackmailing with the threats of their use create horrendous prospects. Secondly, the response to this threat should also cause the concern. The US response to 9/11 has been one of the mix of motives in which exploiting the threat of international terrorism has been conspicuously evident. The vital complexities of global war are thus further complicated by terrorism. Lastly, let's have a look on this notion of clash of civilization and global conflicts. A new perspective on global scale confrontations appeared in the shape of idea of clash of civilizations propounded by Samuel P. Huntington in 1993. This idea holds that economic and ideological antagonism of 19th and 20th century will be overtaken by antagonisms over culture and cultural identity. Nation states will remain the most powerful actors in the world, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and the groups of civilizations. He further stressed, the clash of civilizations will dominate the global politics. The fault lines between civilization will be the battle lines of the future. Huntington may have derived this idea from the increasing hostility between the Islamic world and the United States-led Western states, as underscored by Gulf War in 1990s and the rise of China as a candidate superpower perceived as the potential challenge to the United States. Dear students, this was all about today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. See you in next time with new topic. Goodbye.